Now what I'd like to do is walk through this crunchbase data that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next several lessons. I want to make sure we have a pretty good feel for what fields documents in this collection contain and the values for those fields. Now, here's an example document that I pulled from the company's collection. This is the record for Facebook. Now, the reason why I chose to look at this document is because, as you're aware, documents in a MongoDB collection need not all have exactly the same set of fields. And in this particular collection, companies that are younger or have had less success or simply less activity for whatever reason may be missing fields or values that the records for more prolific companies may contain. So the Facebook record has a nice representation of all of the fields you're likely to encounter in this dataset. So the first thing to note is that there is a name for the company and a permalink. Now the permalink is a unique identifier of sorts in the sense that using this root, we can always find the web page that represents this company by using this permalink. There is also, of course, an underscore ID for every record in this collection, and the underscore ID is an object ID value for every document. Now, you'll also notice that there are URLs that pertain to the company itself, some mention of the number of employees, the year it was founded, as well as month and day. And I should also point out that the most recent records in this dataset are about 2 years old. This is a big dump of crunchbase that was pulled some time ago, before they put in place the API that they now have. I'm using this dataset because it's already been curated somewhat and cleaned up a little bit, so we're not likely to run into too many problems using it. There are some fields in this dataset that are very Crunchbase specific. These dead-pooled fields reference a particular section on Crunchbase for companies that fall into what they call their dead pool. And the dead pool, as you might imagine, are companies that are closing, have been acquired and shut down, or something of that nature. These documents contain a list of tags, some contact information, a very brief description of the company and the space that it's in, and then there's an overview field, which is, depending on the company, anywhere from a sentence to several paragraphs on what the company is, what business they're in, etc. Now, a couple of the fields I'd like to drive into are relationships, competitions, and a couple of the others that are here. Let's look at relationships. Essentially, relationships identifies people who have played one role or another in the company. Typically, these are executives listed. And for every one of these entries in this relationships array, there is an isPast field, and if it's false, that indicates that at the time this record was last updated, this person either still had the title or did not. IsPast being false indicates that Mark Zuckerberg still has these titles. And as we scroll through here, we can see that the relationships array has a great many entries for Facebook, as it does for a lot of these companies. Now, I want to pause here for a moment just to make sure we understand the structure. Now, relationships is a top-level key, meaning that it's not within a nested document. The value of relationships is an array, and the elements within that array are documents that represent a brief summary of a person. Each of those elements has a nested document within it that specifies the first name, last name, and a permalink for the individual. Again, this being a unique identifier across Crunchbase for Mark Zuckerberg or anyone else in this array or a similar array for another company. Okay, so that's relationships. Let's look at competitions. This is really a list of competitors, similar in structure to relationships. Providerships is a list of companies that have provided services for, in this case, Facebook. Again, similar structure to what we saw for relationships and for competitions. Funding rounds is interesting. Lots of detail here in terms of what was raised, when it was raised, and from whom it was raised. And typically there's also a link to an article that talks about the round of funding with a bit of a description, often the title of the article. We can also look at offices, and here we'll find the address, what type of office, whether it's headquarters or just a satellite office, for every office that the company maintains. And then the last field I wanted to look at is this milestones field. So milestones is essentially a chronology or timeline of major events in the lifetime of the company. And a lot of the ones for Facebook, as you can see from what we've scrolled through here, have to do with numbers of users for Facebook. And here's another one. So with each of these milestones, there's typically an article. There is a year, month, and day called the stoned year, stone month, stone day, and the source description field that contains a title or a brief summary of the event. And typically these two are linked together, this being a description of the article that's here. And actually, though I said milestones was the last field I wanted to talk about, I'd actually also like to talk about IPO. Now, given the number of records in this collection, there aren't actually that many, relatively speaking, that have gone to IPO, but of course Facebook has. And so here, with the IPO record, we have an embedded document that describes the valuation amount at the time the IPO occurred, when the IPO occurred, and what the stock symbol is. Okay, so that gives you a nice overview of the fields in the company documents in our collection. And what I've tried to do here is point out some of the fields that we'll be working with as we look at using the Node.js driver to do more and more with MongoDB.